What happens when the entire world falls silent? When airplanes vanish from the skies, cities sleep in the middle of the day, and even the sound of human footsteps disappears? Was it a coincidence of biology, or a whisper from above, reminding us how fragile we truly are? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight we gather for an events story. A story not about one life, but about every life. In tonight's tale, we revisit the days when our earth itself seemed to pause, as though heaven had pressed a finger to its lips and told us, "Be still." We're speaking of the year 2020, when a silent enemy, unseen yet everywhere, swept across borders and shook civilization to its core. But this is not a story of statistics or headlines. It is a story of empty chairs at dinner tables, of unexpected prayers whispered into hospital rooms, of kindness that bloomed in the cracks of fear, and of families rediscovering the warmth of home. The world called it COVID-19. We tonight call it the day the earth stood still. It began with a cough. A single man in Wuhan, China, feverish, restless, dismissed it as nothing unusual. But what no one knew then was that this tiny flicker would soon ignite the greatest shutdown in modern history. Within weeks, borders closed, airports fell silent, and nations locked their doors against each other. By March 2020, cities that had never slept before, New York, London, Paris, Dubai, were deserted. The busiest places in the world resembled ghost towns. Imagine Times Square in New York with no neon lights blinking, no tourists snapping photos. Imagine Mecca with its marble courtyards empty, prayers echoing in solitude. Imagine Venice with waters so still that dolphins swam into canals. The earth was quieter than it had been in centuries. Some scientists even recorded fewer tremors in the planet's crust because humans were no longer rushing across it. But silence does not mean peace. In those early days, fear grew louder than any traffic jam. Supermarket shelves emptied, rumors spread faster than the virus, and masks became symbols of both protection and suspicion. Families clutched one another and wondered, how long? Will we survive this? Is this punishment or a test? And yet, within that silence, small voices began to rise. Nurses in Italy sang from balconies. In Spain, neighbors applauded at 8 p.m. every night to honor their health workers. In Kuwait, in India, in Mexico, people who had never spoken to one another before left food baskets outside strangers' doors. Some called it charity, others survival. But to many it felt like divine mercy, flowing through human hands. One such story comes from a taxi driver in Madrid named Miguel. He was not rich, and when the city shut down, his car sat idle. His income vanished overnight. One evening, passing by a hospital, he saw exhausted doctors and nurses unable to get home after long shifts because buses had stopped running. Miguel turned his car back on. For weeks, he drove them home for free, despite knowing every ride could expose him to infection. When asked why he did it, he replied, "Because God gave me this car. If I cannot use it to serve in a time like this, then what is the point of being alive?" Was Miguel reckless, or was he living proof that in times of darkness, faith can turn even a taxi into a lifeboat? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in New York City, Maria, a single mother, sat in her apartment with her 2 children. Her job as a waitress had vanished when restaurants closed. Rent loomed like a storm cloud. She was not sure food would last the week. Then, one morning, she opened her door to find a bag of groceries. No note, no explanation. Week after week, the bag reappeared. Rice, beans, milk, sometimes even a small toy for her children. She never discovered who left them. But every time she unpacked the bag, she whispered, "Thank you, God." Did an anonymous neighbor bring her hope? Or was it heaven itself working through unseen hands? And so, as the virus spread, so too did these quiet acts of kindness. Humanity was divided by borders, but united by fragility. Suddenly, we were all the same, rich and poor, east and west, believer and skeptic. The virus did not discriminate, but neither did mercy. Yet, while the world learned new ways of caring, it also learned new ways of breaking. Hospitals overflowed. Funerals were held on phone screens. Elders died alone, their families waving goodbye through glass windows. For many, the greatest pain was not the virus itself, but the loneliness it forced upon them. And in those moments, people began asking questions that cut deeper than any headline. What truly matters? Who am I if I cannot hold the hand of the one I love? What is wealth if I cannot buy one more breath? Questions that only faith could answer. But what came next? What the world discovered in its forced stillness would change everything. In Italy, the silence was the loudest of all. Streets that once echoed with scooters, chatter, and the scent of fresh bread were hushed. In Bergamo, a small northern city, military trucks carried coffins out of overcrowded morgues, rows upon rows of unclaimed bodies. Yet above that grief, music still floated. People opened their windows and sang. Entire neighborhoods joined together in trembling chorus. Some sang folk songs, others hymns. One man played the violin from his balcony, as nurses below lifted their heads, tears running down their masks. The notes seemed to rise toward heaven, as though the music itself were pleading, "Lord, do not forget us." Was it mere defiance of despair, or a prayer that God himself inspired? In India, the shutdown took on another form. Millions of migrant workers who lived hand-to-mouth in bustling cities suddenly found themselves without work, money, or shelter. With buses and trains halted, they began to walk, sometimes hundreds of miles, to return to their villages. Families carried children, elderly parents, even goats, on their backs. Some collapsed on highways. Others never reached home. One young man named Ravi carried his paralyzed father on a bicycle, pedaling nearly 800 kilometers through scorching heat. When journalists asked why, he answered simply, "God gave me my father. If I abandon him now, then what kind of son am I? What would you have done in his place? Could you summon such strength? Or does love itself create miracles when reason fails?" And in America, where skyscrapers once symbolized unstoppable progress, the virus revealed fragility. New York became the global epicenter. Sirens wailed night after night. Refrigerated trucks lined hospital backlots, serving as makeshift morgues. Nurses taped phones to IV poles so families could video call dying relatives. For some, it was the first time they prayed in years. For others, it was the last prayer they would ever hear. One ICU nurse, Sarah, recalled whispering the Lord's Prayer to patients who could not breathe, holding their hands in latex gloves. She had not prayed since childhood, but in those nights, surrounded by death, she found herself calling out to God again. Not for herself, but for others. "I felt," she said, "as if heaven was closer in those hospital rooms than anywhere else on earth." Isn't it strange how God often returns to us in places we least expect? Yet while tragedy consumed the headlines, something else was stirring. Something hidden. Something quieter. Families rediscovered the sacredness of time. In countless homes, fathers who had always been away at offices sat down at dinner tables again. Mothers, once rushing between tasks, paused to read bedtime stories. Children played board games in candlelit rooms when power failed. In some places, neighbors who had lived beside each other for years met for the first time. Through open windows, across balconies, through songs and waves. And in the stillness, people heard things they had long forgotten. Birds singing in polluted cities, the whisper of the wind in empty highways. Their own thoughts echoing louder than the world's noise. Some said the earth itself was healing, but others wondered, was it not the earth that healed, but the human heart? There were, of course, darker choices too. Some hoarded food and sold masks at inflated prices. Others spread lies, feeding panic. It was a season of both angels and wolves. Humanity revealed both its ugliest and its most radiant faces. Perhaps that was the divine test. When pressed, who would we become? One story from the UK tells of an elderly man, 90 years old, who refused a ventilator. The doctors pleaded he had a chance to live, but he insisted it be given to someone younger. Days later, he passed away quietly. His family said his last words were, "My race is run. Give someone else a chance." What drives a person to surrender his own breath so another might inhale? Foolishness or faith in something greater than himself? Even governments, powerful, proud, were humbled. Presidents and prime ministers who once boasted of control suddenly found themselves powerless before an invisible enemy. Stock markets crashed, oil prices collapsed, planes rusted on tarmacs. The mighty bowed to the microscopic. And yet, in that humbling, there was a lesson that no matter how tall our towers, no matter how deep our vaults, we are dust before the breath of God. Perhaps the earth did not stand still because of a virus. Perhaps heaven itself whispered, "Remember who holds tomorrow." And then came the images that burned into our collective memory. A priest in northern Italy blessing rows of coffins alone. An imam in Pakistan calling for prayer into an empty mosque. The Pope standing in a rain-soaked St. Peter's Square, utterly alone, holding up the Eucharist to a deserted city. The silence was not absence. It was awe. The earth had never been so still. But maybe it had never listened so carefully either. But the stillness would not last. Because soon, people began to push back. Some resisted the closures, some denied the danger, and divisions widened. Yet in that chaos lay the next twist, the rediscovery of what it means to belong and to believe. In the early weeks of the shutdown, something strange appeared across the world. Drawings of rainbows taped to windows. Children too young to grasp the science of pandemics found crayons and hope. They wrote words like, "It will be okay," and "Stay strong" in shaky handwriting. Passers-by paused to smile at the colors. For many, those rainbows were the only touch of joy on otherwise gray days. In England, a 7-year-old girl named Amelia wrote a note under her rainbow. "To my grandma, I love you. I can't hug you now, but I will hug you soon." Her grandmother lived just 2 blocks away, but Amelia had not seen her in weeks. Instead, they waved through glass windows, palms pressed on opposite sides. How many of us realized then, the simplest touch of a hand was a blessing we had taken for granted? Meanwhile, in Brazil, favelas, dense neighborhoods where families lived shoulder to shoulder, faced an impossible challenge. How do you socially distance when 10 people share one room? Yet it was here, in some of the poorest corners, that extraordinary kindness emerged. One anonymous donor, known only by the nickname Angel of Rio, delivered food parcels to thousands of homes without revealing his identity. Some whispered it was a wealthy businessman. Others believed it was a group of volunteers pooling their wages. But many mothers told their children it was God providing. "When you open the door and find bread," one said, "you do not ask whose hands placed it there. You thank heaven." And isn't that true of many blessings? Not all generosity came from wealth. In New Delhi, a beggar who survived by collecting coins near a temple surprised locals. With no visitors to the temple, his cup stayed empty. Yet when volunteers offered him food, he accepted only half. "Give the rest," he said, "to someone hungrier." He had nothing, and still he gave. Was this not the very sermon humanity needed? Preached not by a priest nor an imam, but by a man barefoot on the street. In America, contradictions collided. Billionaires pledged millions for vaccines, while nurses begged for masks. Politicians argued on television, while neighbors slipped cash under each other's doors. Grocery clerks, once invisible, were suddenly called heroes. Ordinary people risked their lives stocking shelves, driving buses, delivering mail. Society discovered that the hands it had overlooked were the ones holding it together. One cashier, Angela, told reporters, "People used to toss coins at me without looking. Now they look into my eyes and say, 'Thank you.' Maybe that's the miracle in all this. Do we only realize the sacredness of people once survival depends on them? Yet even in this rediscovery, fractures appeared. Families argued over whether to isolate or gather. Friends fought over masks. Strangers clashed in supermarkets. Some claimed the virus was overblown. Others called it Judgment Day. The same silence that inspired reflection also exposed division. Humanity, it seemed, was both united and torn apart. Perhaps this was the hidden mirror the shutdown held before us. Not just who we are in public, but who we are behind closed doors. Consider the story of Ahmed in Cairo. A devout man, he spent every dawn in the mosque. But when mosques closed, his faith faltered. "If I cannot kneel in God's house," he asked, "does he still hear me?" For weeks he stopped praying. But one night his young daughter, only 6, placed her small hands together and whispered a prayer for him at bedtime. Her words were simple. "Please God, make my father smile again." Tears streamed down Ahmed's face. He realized then, God's house was not a building, but the beating hearts of believers. And his faith returned, stronger than before. How many of us rediscovered God in unexpected places? In a child's words, in a neighbor's kindness, in the silence of our own homes. But faith was not the only thing reborn. Creativity blossomed in confinement. Musicians streamed concerts from living rooms. Teachers taught from kitchen tables. Weddings were held on video calls, with guests dressed up from the waist up. Even funerals became virtual, as families lit candles simultaneously in different countries, connected not by touch but by light. It was strange, imperfect, sometimes heartbreaking. Yet it revealed a truth. Humanity cannot be fully shut down. When one door closes, another opens, sometimes on a glowing screen, sometimes in the soul. Still, a question lingered, unspoken. When the world started moving again, would we remember these lessons? Or would we rush back into the noise, forgetting the whispers we heard in the stillness? Because in the quiet, God had shown us many things. The fragility of our breath, the treasure of time, the power of kindness, and the weight of faith. But memory is fickle, and hearts are restless. Would the earth standing still change humanity forever? Or was it only a pause button, waiting to be pressed again? When the first whispers of reopening came, they carried both relief and dread. Shops prepared to unlock their doors, children dreamed of running back to playgrounds, and workers longed for paychecks again. But behind every sigh of relief was a question that cut like a knife. What is worth more, our livelihood or our life? Governments framed it as balancing the economy. But for ordinary families, it was a kitchen table dilemma. Mothers asked, "Do I risk infection to feed my children?" Sons asked, "Do I keep working or do I stay home to protect my parents?" It was no longer about politicians and policies. It was about rice, rent, and breath. In Mexico City, Lucia, a street vendor, faced this choice. Her small cart of tamales was her only income. During the shutdown, she borrowed money from neighbors, but debt grew like a shadow. When officials announced the chance to reopen, her children begged her not to go. But she kissed their foreheads and whispered, "God protects us, but He also gave us hands to work." Every morning she returned to her cart, selling food behind a mask stitched from an old pillowcase. She risked her life daily, not for greed but for survival. Was she reckless, or was she faithful in action? In the United States, reopening was even more divided. Some cities burst with protests against lockdowns, crowds chanting for freedom. Others pleaded to extend restrictions, fearing another wave of death. The same virus that had united humanity in fear now split it apart in ideology. One pastor in the Midwest faced this very storm. His congregation begged him to reopen church doors, arguing that faith must never be silenced. Others warned that gathering would spread the disease. For nights he prayed, torn between protecting bodies and protecting souls. In the end, he chose to hold services in a parking lot, with families sitting in cars, honking "Amen" instead of shouting it. Some mocked it as absurd, but others wept, saying it was the purest worship they had ever experienced, proof that nothing could silence faith. Perhaps that was the hidden moral. God does not require walls to be worshipped. Meanwhile, scientists raced like never before. Laboratories in Germany, the US, and Russia worked day and night, testing, failing, starting again. The entire globe prayed for one thing: a cure. But even as vaccines were promised, mistrust spread just as quickly as the virus itself. Some feared needles more than infection. Others saw salvation in science as rival to salvation in God. Families argued at dinner tables. Will you take it? Will you let your children? This was not just a medical crisis. It was a spiritual one. Who do we trust when the world trembles? Doctors, politicians, or the unseen hand above them all? In South Africa, a moral crisis unfolded. Hospitals lacked space. Doctors faced impossible choices. 2 patients, 1 ventilator. Whom do you save? The young father of 3? The grandmother who raised her whole family? The nurse who had already saved dozens of lives? In those moments, even science could not answer. Only conscience and prayer. One physician confessed, "Each decision haunted me. I placed my hand on their chest and prayed before choosing. Some nights, I begged God to guide me, because I could not bear to carry this alone." And maybe that is what the shutdown revealed most clearly, that no matter how modern or advanced we think we are, in the deepest valley, we still fall to our knees. Yet, as reopening spread, another lesson emerged: what people chose to value when given back the gift of choice. Some rushed first to malls, eager to buy clothes they didn't need. Others went straight to bars, desperate to drown the silence. But many chose differently. They drove to see parents they had not hugged in months. They booked plane tickets to visit siblings, even at risk. They knelt in mosques, churches, and temples, whispering gratitude. In Milan, one man, upon stepping out after 70 days, walked not to a store, but to the cemetery. He placed flowers on his mother's grave, whispering, "I never got to say goodbye." How many of us realize then that goodbyes are a privilege, not a guarantee? Yet, even with reopenings, the world was far from healed. Some families had lost not only loved ones, but livelihoods, homes, entire futures. The silence had taken more than voices. It had stolen plans, dreams, even weddings and graduations. And though cities filled again, many hearts remained empty. In Tokyo, a bride named Hana wept as she wore her wedding dress alone in her apartment, her ceremony canceled. Yet, as she wiped her tears, her fiancé joined her on a video call, both dressed in their finest. He whispered vows through a screen, she smiled through sobs. "It wasn't the wedding I dreamed of," she later said, "but perhaps God wanted us to learn that marriage is not about the party, but the promise." Was this not the very heartbeat of the shutdown, stripping away the glitter to reveal the gold? But even as these lessons unfolded, a darker question loomed. With vaccines on the horizon and economies stirring, many rushed to declare the crisis over. Yet others feared, had humanity truly changed, or were we racing to forget? And if forgetting meant returning to arrogance, greed, and division, what would God allow next to remind us? The phrase "new normal" became a mantra, though no one truly knew what it meant. Streets filled again, but faces were covered. Smiles hid behind fabric, laughter muffled by masks. Shaking hands, once the simplest gesture of trust, was suddenly taboo. A cough in public drew suspicious eyes sharper than any crime. The virus had not only invaded our bodies, it had invaded our trust. In Tokyo, subway trains ran once more, but passengers sat apart, avoiding each other's gaze. In Paris, cafes reopened, yet tables were spaced like chess pieces on a board. In Nairobi, markets bustled again, but vendors wore gloves, exchanging money through plastic sheets. Humanity had returned to movement, but not to intimacy. And in this distance, a subtle hunger grew, not for food, but for connection. People craved a hug more than bread, a handshake more than gold. It was as if the virus reminded us that touch is not trivial. It is sacred. Children adapted fastest. In Los Angeles, schools reopened with plastic shields and sanitizer at every desk. Teachers wore face shields, voices muffled, yet children still laughed, drawing rainbows and scribbling notes like, "We beat the virus." They played tag by tapping elbows instead of hands. To them, the rules were not punishment, but a new game. Perhaps God had built resilience into the smallest among us, to remind the elders that hope is learned from children. But for elders, it was different. For many, the new normal meant exile. Nursing homes became fortresses. Families visited parents through windows, waving, shouting, crying. In Chicago, one son lifted a ladder to his mother's second-floor window, singing her favorite lullaby from outside because she could not risk visitors. She pressed her hand to the glass as if to feel his voice through the pane. Isn't it striking that in an age of wealth and technology, we rediscovered the worth of something as simple as holding a hand? Meanwhile, businesses reinvented themselves. Restaurants became delivery hubs, gyms turned into Zoom classrooms, and offices shrank into laptops at kitchen tables. Some thrived, others collapsed. Billionaires doubled their wealth, while millions stood in unemployment lines. The gap between abundance and hunger widened. It was a paradox. One neighbor ordered groceries, delivered by drone, while another neighbor prayed for bread, and in that contrast lay the moral wound of the pandemic. Would the strong share with the weak, or would survival sharpen selfishness? One story from South Korea lingers. A man named Ji-hoon, who ran a successful electronics company, saw profits rise during lockdown. Yet instead of pocketing them, he quietly paid the debts of dozens of struggling families in his neighborhood. He left no signature, no letter. Families only discovered when collectors stopped knocking. When asked later why he did it, he shrugged, "What is wealth if my neighbor's child starves? God gave me extra. It wasn't mine to keep." Compare this with another businessman in the same city who hoarded masks and sold them for 10 times their worth. When caught, his defense was simple. "I was only doing business." The court fined him, but the greater judgment was already written in the whispers of his community. Two men, two choices. One gave life, the other took advantage. Which one do we resemble in our own trials? Religion, too, adjusted. Mosques, churches, temples, once echoing with gatherings, found themselves half empty. Chairs distanced, hymns sung softly through masks. Yet paradoxically, faith expanded beyond walls. Online sermons reached millions who had never stepped inside a sanctuary. Families prayed together at home, rediscovering that worship is not limited to stained glass or marble floors. In one village in the Philippines, neighbors began nightly prayers via megaphones, each household reciting verses from balconies. The entire town became one open-air cathedral. Some said it felt closer to God than the grandest basilicas. Maybe that was the hidden lesson. When walls close, heaven opens wider. Still, the new normal came with invisible scars. Anxiety rose, depression deepened. Children absorbed their parents' fears. Some teenagers whispered that the future felt stolen, that milestones like graduations, sports, and friendships were lost years. A young woman in Canada wrote in her diary, "It feels like the world pressed pause on my life. What if it never presses play again?" Her words echo what millions felt, a grief not for death, but for time. Because time once lost is never returned. And yet, even in this grief, there were sparks of resilience. In Brazil, families danced on rooftops. In India, neighbors shared meals across balconies. In Lebanon, musicians played violins to entire streets. Humanity kept finding ways to say, "We are still here. We still believe." But beneath it all, a greater question smoldered. If the virus did not destroy us, what would we do with the life we were spared? Would we rebuild stronger or repeat our old mistakes? The earth had stood still. But now that it began to turn again, would humanity's heart keep pace or fall back asleep? Sacrifice became the silent thread weaving through the shutdown. Not the loud sacrifice of armies or revolutions, but the quiet kind, unnoticed, uncelebrated, yet eternal in its weight. In New York, a bus driver named Thomas continued his routes even when nearly half his colleagues fell ill. He knew each trip was a gamble. His wife begged him to quit, but he answered softly, "If I stop, who will take the nurses to the hospital?" Weeks later, Thomas himself grew sick. He died gasping for air, far from the passengers he once carried. At his funeral, dozens of nurses lined the street, holding signs. "You carried us. Now may God carry you." What drives a man to give his breath for strangers? Perhaps only love, and the belief that God sees even when the world does not. In Italy, a priest named Father Giuseppe gave up his ventilator to a younger patient. When asked why, he smiled faintly, "I am ready." Let him live. He passed away days later, his final sermon preached not with words, but with sacrifice. For those who knew him, it was proof that faith does not end at the altar. It lives in the moment when breath itself is surrendered for another. Do we recognize such saints among us? Or do we only see them when their seats are empty? But sacrifice was not only about life and death. For many, it meant giving up dreams. Couples postponed weddings, students missed graduations, athletes lost seasons that would never return. In Manila, a young dancer named Aisha had trained for years for a world competition. When it was canceled, she collapsed in tears. Yet instead of abandoning her art, she began teaching children in her neighborhood for free, gathering them on rooftops with masks, letting rhythm heal what words could not. Later she said, "Perhaps God closed one stage so he could open another." Isn't it true? Sometimes the loss we mourn is only the path to a blessing we cannot yet see. Still, for others, the sacrifice was unbearable. In Brazil, a father named Paulo worked 3 jobs to save for his daughter's university tuition. When the pandemic destroyed his income, he spent sleepless nights wondering if her dreams had died with his wages. Yet one evening, she told him, "Papa, I don't need college to make you proud. I just need you alive." He broke down, realizing the lesson, that love is not measured in diplomas or dollars, but in presence. How often do we chase the future so fiercely that we forget the gift of now? Meanwhile, frontline workers across the world lived a paradox, praised as heroes, yet treated as disposable. Nurses collapsed from exhaustion, doctors slept on hospital floors, cleaners scrubbed hallways, drenched in danger. Some were cheered from balconies, others were shunned in supermarkets. Out of fear, they carried the virus. One nurse in Nairobi said bitterly, "We are angels at work, but demons in the street." Her words cut deep. How quick we are to applaud with hands, but slow to embrace with hearts. Even within homes, sacrifices multiplied. Mothers went without meals so children could eat. Elderly parents hid symptoms, fearing they would burden their families. Students shared one phone for online classes, siblings taking turns while futures slipped quietly away. None of these acts made headlines, but perhaps in heaven's ledger, they mattered more than the speeches of kings. And yet, with each sacrifice came a mirror. Humanity was forced to ask, what do we truly value? Was it comfort or compassion? Was it convenience or community? Was it wealth or the breath of the one beside us? In London, when lockdown lifted briefly, crowds swarmed to luxury stores. People spent thousands on handbags and watches, desperate to feel normal. Yet across the city, a nurse sat outside her small apartment, counting coins to buy bread. 2 worlds in the same city, but light years apart. Perhaps that was the sharpest lesson of the pandemic, that suffering was not shared equally. Some lived it as inconvenience, others lived it as apocalypse. And in that divide lay a warning. If we forget the unequal weight of pain, then the next silence may come not from a virus, but from our own hearts turning cold. Still, glimmers of eternity shone through. Families long estranged called one another again. Neighbors who once passed without greeting now exchanged meals. In Turkey, the call to prayer echoed across empty streets, sounding louder than ever before, as if heaven itself had leaned closer. Yes, The earth had stood still. But in that stillness, some souls finally began to move. But the question that haunted many was this: would humanity keep these lessons once the doors of the world swung open fully? Or would the hunger for normal devour the wisdom we had been handed in silence? The answer would unfold in ways more surprising and more sobering than anyone expected. When the world's doors creaked open, many thought the silence was over. But in truth, another silence began. The silence inside hearts. The pandemic had spared lives, yet left shadows that no vaccine could erase. Doctors called it long COVID, but the world soon discovered there was also a long silence. Anxiety, depression, and grief stalked homes even after restrictions lifted. Children who had once skipped joyfully into classrooms now clung to parents, afraid of separation. Teenagers scrolled endlessly, unable to focus, their dreams blurred by months of uncertainty. Adults returned to jobs, but found themselves hollow, like actors reciting lines without believing the play. It was as if the virus had retreated from lungs, but stayed in souls. In Toronto, a teacher named Daniel noticed his students' laughter had changed. It was thinner, fragile, easily broken. One day he asked them to write essays on what they had learned during lockdown. A girl wrote, "I learned that I can lose everything in one day, so I don't trust tomorrow anymore." Her words pierced him. How do you teach hope to children who had seen the world itself fall apart? That night, Daniel lit a candle at his desk and prayed, something he had not done in years. "Lord," he whispered, "teach me to give them faith, because I do not know how." Perhaps the hidden miracle of the pandemic was not in hospitals or laboratories, but in classrooms where broken children and weary teachers learned to kneel together. But even as faith flickered in some, despair deepened in others. In Seoul, suicide hotlines reported record calls. In New York, therapists were overwhelmed with patients grieving not only loved ones but futures. A young bride widowed just months after her wedding asked her counselor, "Why would God give me love, only to take it so soon?" Such questions echoed everywhere. Why this? Why now? Why us? And though answers rarely came, one truth emerged. In every culture, in every language, people reached upward more than ever. Temples saw returning worshipers. Online prayers multiplied. Mosques overflowed when doors reopened. Humanity, humbled, looked skyward. Could it be that God had used silence to bring us back to his voice? Yet the scars were not only emotional, they were also societal. Workers demanded flexibility after tasting time at home. Some companies adapted, others pushed back. Families moved closer together or further apart. Divorce rates spiked in some nations, while baby booms rose in others. The pandemic had shaken every relationship, and each responded differently. In Argentina, a couple who had barely spoken in years found themselves locked down together. At first, silence suffocated them, but slowly, without the distractions of work and traffic, they began to talk again. First about groceries, then about memories, then about dreams. By the end of lockdown, they renewed their vows in their backyard, tears falling as their children clapped. Contrast that with a couple in London who, after months of confinement, realized their love had been built on routine, not truth. They parted quietly without bitterness. The same storm, yet opposite outcomes. Perhaps God does not cause the storm, but he reveals foundations through it. Communities, too, bore scars. In rural India, villages built memorial stones listing names of those lost. In Italy, church bells tolled daily for months. In America, murals of masked nurses appeared on city walls, painted as angels with wings. Memory carved itself not only into hearts, but into streets and skylines. And yet, as tributes rose, so did denial. Some refused to believe the virus had ever been real. Others dismissed the dead as numbers. Truth itself became contested ground. What had been a shared experience of fragility threatened to fracture into endless arguments. Perhaps that was the most dangerous silence, the refusal to remember. Because forgetting pain does not heal it. it only prepares the ground for its return. Still, through all of this, stories of awakening glimmered. In Nigeria, a young man who had once chased money relentlessly began volunteering at an orphanage after losing his father to the virus. "I realized," he said, "that wealth cannot buy breath, but love can outlive it." In Japan, an atheist scientist who spent years mocking religion quietly began attending temple prayers, telling friends, "The virus humbled me. I saw that for all my knowledge, I was powerless. And perhaps power is not in us, but above us." In small ways, in hidden corners, faith rekindled. And maybe that was the divine whisper all along, to remind us where strength truly lies. But even as humanity crawled toward healing, one haunting question remained. Had we actually learned? Or were we simply desperate to erase the memory and run back into noise? The earth had stood still once. Could it stand still again? And if so, would we listen this time? The silence of the pandemic did not only change individuals, it rewired the entire world. When factories stopped, skies cleared, birds returned to cities, dolphins were spotted near harbors, and air grew cleaner in weeks than decades of climate summits had achieved. For a fleeting moment, humanity saw the earth breathing easier without us. But the question lingered, was this a glimpse of healing or a warning of how fragile creation truly is? In Delhi, a boy looked up at stars his father had never seen before, because pollution had always hidden them. "Papa," he whispered, "did God just move the sky closer?" Perhaps not closer, but certainly clearer. And maybe the real question was whether we would let it cloud again. Technology also surged forward with lightning speed. Meetings moved to screens, classrooms to laptops, even weddings and funerals to glowing rectangles. Suddenly, distance shrank. A grandmother in Cairo could attend her grandson's birthday in Chicago with a click. A doctor in Germany advised patients in Kenya via video. The pandemic forced the world to connect in ways once unimaginable. But as connection grew, so did isolation. People spoke through devices but felt more alone than ever. Was it progress, or proof that no screen can replace the warmth of a hand? Inequality, too, revealed itself brutally. The wealthy ordered groceries online, while the poor waited in food bank lines that stretched for miles. Billionaires' fortunes soared, even as millions lost jobs. Some nations bought vaccines by the millions, while others begged for scraps. The virus did not discriminate, but privilege did. One doctor in Ghana said bitterly, "We treat the same disease, but not the same humanity." And this became the deeper wound. Not just the loss of life, but the loss of fairness. Was the shutdown meant to reveal not only our fragility, but also our failure to love one another as equals? Yet even in inequality, solidarity bloomed. In South America, farmers donated tons of unsold produce to the poor. In the United States, restaurants turned into free kitchens. In Kuwait, mosques delivered food parcels to entire neighborhoods, regardless of religion. Strangers who had never spoken before became lifelines to one another. Perhaps that was the paradox. While the virus divided by privilege, it also united through compassion. The choice was always ours. And faith. Faith grew in unexpected ways. For some, it was the first time they opened a holy book in years. For others, it was the first time they prayed not for themselves, but for the world. In Brazil, a hospital chaplain recalled, "I walked past rooms and heard prayers in every language. Arabic, Spanish, English, whispers to heaven, rising like a single choir." Was it coincidence? Or was God reminding us that in fragility, we are all children of the same breath? Yet as months passed, a strange shift occurred. Many became restless, desperate to move on. News anchors declared victory too soon, parties resumed, crowds gathered. But beneath the noise, something uneasy stirred. Depression, mistrust, and fatigue grew. Some asked, why didn't the world change more? Was it all for nothing? In France, a young poet wrote, "The virus left us masks, but not wisdom. We wear cloth, but not humility." Her words captured the disillusionment many felt, that humanity had been given a chance to transform, but instead rushed to forget. Still, some transformations could not be undone. Remote work reshaped economies. Global supply chains rethought their fragility. Families redefined priorities. A father in Chicago who once traveled weekly for business confessed, "The shutdown forced me to know my son. I will never give that back, even if the world demands it." And that is the mystery. Perhaps the shutdown did not change humanity as a whole, but it changed millions of individual hearts. And sometimes, that is how the world shifts, one soul at a time. Yet, with every step toward recovery, the haunting truth remained. Scars cannot be erased. A child who lost her grandmother to the virus would never forget the window through which she waved goodbye. A nurse who whispered prayers into dying ears would carry those echoes forever. A generation that saw the earth fall silent would never see tomorrow as ordinary again. The world moved forward, but deep down, we all knew we were not the same. And here lies the twist. Survival was not the end of the story, because what awaited beyond survival was something more complex, more dangerous, and perhaps more divine. The reckoning of what we would do with this second chance. Would we honor it or waste it? When the silence finally broke, humanity found itself standing at a crossroads. On one path lay remembrance, carrying forward the lessons of fragility, kindness, and faith. On the other path lay forgetfulness, rushing back into noise, greed, and division. The question was not whether the earth would turn again, but whether our hearts would. Governments promised building back better. Speeches filled with hope echoed from parliaments and Congress halls. Yet for the widow counting pennies, for the child who had lost her father, for the nurse with scars etched into her soul, words felt thin. What they wanted was not slogans, but substance. And in many places, it was ordinary people, not leaders, who became the true architects of healing. In a small town in Italy, a bakery reopened with a sign in the window, "If you cannot pay, take bread anyway." For months, locals supported the shop by donating coins in a jar, covering the cost for the needy. Soon, the shop became a symbol, not just of bread, but of hope. In Argentina, a retired seamstress began sewing masks for children who could not afford them. She had little money, but her hands were rich with skill. "God gave me time," she said. "Why would I waste it?" Stories like these were the real economy of recovery, an economy of compassion. But alongside compassion, impatience grew. In cities across the world, people flooded nightclubs, stadiums, and shopping centers as though erasing the silence with noise. "We survived," they shouted, "so let us celebrate." Yet beneath the celebration, shadows lingered. Many had not survived. Many were still mourning. For them, the noise was not joy, it was cruelty. In Spain, a mother named Clara wept when her neighbors threw a street party just weeks after her husband died. "How can they dance," she whispered, "when my house is still dark?" Her question exposed the deeper fracture. Could joy and grief coexist? Or had society grown too eager to forget those still in mourning? Faith communities wrestled with the same dilemma. Some declared the virus a test from God. Others called it a punishment. Still others saw it as a chance for renewal. Mosques, churches, and temples filled again, but not always with the same humility felt during lockdown. Some returned to worship as habit, forgetting the tears they once shed in isolation. And yet, in other corners, worship deepened. A pastor in Brazil said, "My church is smaller now, but it is stronger." Those who come now do not come for tradition. They come because they have seen the valley of death, and they know who walked with them through it. Perhaps that was the quiet separation between faith as ritual and faith as lifeline. Nations, too, revealed their choices. Some invested in healthcare, determined never to be caught unprepared again. Others slashed budgets, eager to move on. Some spoke of global solidarity, while others turned inward, hoarding vaccines and closing borders. The virus had shown us we were one body, but once the fever broke, many pretended otherwise. A diplomat in Africa said bitterly, "During the sickness, the world said we are all equal. But when the medicine came, we were not." Was this humanity's greatest hypocrisy or its greatest chance to repent? And individuals, ordinary men and women, faced their own reckonings. Some emerged softer, kinder, more faithful. Others hardened, skeptical, angry. The silence had been a teacher, but not all students listen. Consider two stories from the same neighborhood in Chicago. One man, after losing his job, started a community garden to feed others. He said, "The earth gave me food when money didn't. I want to pass that gift on." Just 2 blocks away, another man, also unemployed, hoarded supplies and refused to share, muttering, "No one helped me. Why should I help them?" The same storm, the same silence, but 2 different souls. And isn't that always the question? Not what happens to us, but what we choose to become because of it. Yet, as the world stumbled toward recovery, another truth became impossible to ignore. The pandemic had not only taken lives, it had taken trust. Trust in governments, in science, in each other. Suspicion lingered like smoke after a fire. And without trust, rebuilding felt shaky. Perhaps that was the greatest aftershock of the earth standing still. Not the silence itself, but the echoes it left behind. And then came the haunting realization. What if the shutdown had not been the final chapter, but only the prologue of a new age of crises, each demanding the same questions of faith, compassion, and resilience? Had humanity prepared its soul, or only its schedules? Time moved forward, yet the memory of the great stillness lingered, sometimes as a whisper, sometimes as a wound. Humanity stood at the edge of recovery, but every step forward raised a question. Would we carry the lessons of silence, or bury them beneath noise? For some, memory became a compass. In Germany, a family that once rushed through life began observing a weekly silent night, turning off phones, eating together by candlelight, and recalling the days when the world had paused. "We do this," the father said, "so we never forget that life is more than speed." In Japan, survivors of the shutdown planted a forest of remembrance, trees for each loved one lost. Visitors walked among them in hushed reverence, reminded that behind every number was a soul, behind every statistic, a story. These acts did not erase grief, but they transformed it into legacy. Yet, elsewhere, forgetting spread faster than remembrance. Cities surged with traffic, malls with shoppers, skies with planes. The earth roared back into noise. People spoke of normal, as if the silence had never existed. A cafe in Paris hung a sign, "No masks, no memories." And patrons cheered. But beneath the laughter, some hearts broke. A widow from Madrid who lost her husband to the virus said softly, "The world dances as if nothing happened. But my world will never be the same." Her words revealed the fracture between those who could forget and those who carried scars too deep to ignore. Faith communities wrestled with this tension as well. Some leaders warned, "Do not waste the silence God gave us." Others admitted their congregations had slipped back into routine. Yet pockets of renewal remained. In Lagos, a mosque began weekly charity drives that never stopped, born during lockdown and continued by choice. In Chicago, a church turned its parking lot services into a permanent outreach for the homeless. In Manila, young volunteers who once delivered food during the crisis kept their network alive, transforming it into a movement called Hands of Mercy. Perhaps that was the divine whisper, that if silence was temporary, mercy must be permanent. Nations, too, revealed their choices in the aftermath. Some invested in hospitals, supply chains, and research, preparing for storms to come. Others cut corners, declaring, "It was just a once-in-a-century event." Yet history's irony is cruel. What we dismiss as rare often returns when we least expect it. A historian in London wrote, "The greatest danger of 2020 is not the virus itself. It is the arrogance of forgetting." And isn't that true of all trials? that the greatest wound is not what we endure, but what we refuse to learn. The silence had also birthed unexpected seeds. Remote work reshaped families. Some parents vowed never to lose the closeness they had gained with their children. Farmers explored local markets when borders shut, reducing dependence on distant supply chains. Communities redefined resilience, not as wealth, but as neighborliness. One grandmother in Mexico summed it up best. During the virus, we had little, but we shared. That is what kept us alive. If we forget that, then we learned nothing. And yet, humanity remained divided. In one part of the world, lessons of humility grew into movements of mercy. In another, denial fueled arrogance. For some, the pandemic became a story of rediscovery. For others, it became a story best erased. Perhaps this is the true legacy of the shutdown, that it revealed not one humanity, but two. The humanity that remembers and the humanity that forgets. Still, the memory is not gone. For those who lived through it, echoes remain. The echo of empty streets at noon. The echo of neighbors singing from balconies. The echo of whispered prayers into hospital walls. These echoes remind us the earth once stood still, and so did we. And maybe, just maybe, heaven still waits to see. Did we learn? Or must we be reminded again? As the years slipped forward, the Great Shutdown began to fade into history books. But memory is not measured in textbooks. It is measured in souls. And for many, the echoes still whispered. In Milan, an old violinist who once played from his balcony continued to perform every evening at dusk, long after crowds returned to streets. When asked why, he smiled. Because one day, when silence ruled, my music carried hope. And I cannot let that hope die. His notes drifted into traffic, blending with horns and voices. Some ignored him, rushing past. Others stopped, closed their eyes, and remembered. It was a reminder. History lives not only in what we record, but in what we repeat. In São Paulo, a doctor kept a small notebook of names, every patient he lost during those months. He carried it in his pocket even after hospitals emptied. So, I never forget that each number was a face, he said. Whenever someone dismissed the pandemic as exaggerated, he opened the notebook silently, pointing to the names. Sometimes, silence is the only reply. And in New York, Maria, the single mother who once found groceries at her doorstep, discovered her mysterious benefactor years later. It was her elderly neighbor, Mr. Hernandez, who had quietly sacrificed his pension to keep her family fed. When she asked him why, he answered, "Because when I prayed, God told me you were his child too. And what father does not feed his children?" She wept, realizing that heaven's hand had always been just next door. But for every story of remembrance, there was also one of forgetting. In Dubai, luxury towers celebrated with fireworks, while foreign workers who had kept the city alive during lockdown went home penniless. In Los Angeles, corporations reported record profits, while thousands of evicted families slept in cars. The silence had exposed inequality, but the noise returned it. Was this not the deepest test? That God had paused the earth to show us who we are, yet many chose to cover the mirror? Still, divine patterns could not be erased. Across nations, people who once lived for speed discovered stillness as a discipline. Parents who once raced past their children discovered the holiness of bedtime prayers. Neighbors who once ignored one another now greeted with warmth, remembering when those greetings were all they had. It was as if the shutdown had planted seeds, tiny, invisible, that grew in secret hearts. Not all bore fruit, but where they did, they changed lives forever. One man in Cairo, Ahmed, the father who once lost his faith when mosques closed, became a leader of neighborhood prayer circles. He often told people, "God never left us. We left him when we believed faith only lived inside walls. But he was with us in our homes, in our children's voices, in the silence itself." And across the world, countless others echoed the same truth. that silence had not been absence, it had been invitation. Perhaps that is the spiritual paradox of the shutdown. It was tragedy and mercy at once. Tragedy in its deaths, its grief, its scars, but mercy in its lessons, its reminders, its awakenings. God had taken away noise, not to punish, but to reveal. And now the question remains, not for governments, not for history, but for each heart. What did we do with that revelation? In Mexico, the grandmother who once called love the greatest wealth sat with her grandchildren years later. They asked her, "Abuela, what was it like when the world stopped?" She looked at them, her eyes misty, and replied, "It was frightening. But it was also the time I heard God the clearest. He reminded us that life is not guaranteed, but love is always a choice." Her words capture what no statistic ever could. That when the earth stood still, it was not emptiness we found, but eternity breaking through. But as new generations grow, as the memory fades, a haunting question lingers. Will the world forget so deeply that it must be reminded again? The earth once stood still. Could it be asked to pause once more? When historians look back on the year the earth stood still, they will write of infection rates, vaccine rollouts, and government decrees. But those who lived it know better. The true history was not in numbers, but in faces. It was in the neighbor who left food at the door, the nurse who prayed over strangers, the child who drew rainbows and wrote, "It will be okay." It was also in the cracks, the anger, the greed, the fear. The world was shown a mirror, and not everyone liked what they saw. Some chose humility, others chose arrogance. The silence did not change everyone equally, but it gave everyone a choice. Perhaps that was the divine design, not to force, but to reveal. In the Middle East, a shopkeeper told his children, "When the mosques closed, I thought God was far. But then I saw neighbors share bread, and I realized God was closer than ever." In Canada, a mother whispered, "When schools closed, I thought my children would fall behind. But then I watched them pray at night, and I realized they were learning something greater than books." In Kenya, a young man confessed, "I lost my job. I thought I lost my future. But then I started helping at the orphanage, and I found a purpose I never had before." Each voice was a fragment of the larger story, that the silence stripped away illusions, leaving only what truly mattered. But even as these stories shine, shadows remain. Some scars will never heal. An empty chair at dinner, an unfinished conversation, a hug that never came. These absences remind us that not all silence is gentle. Some silence aches, and yet, even in that ache, many found God. A widow in Spain said, "I still cry when I see couples holding hands. But in my loneliness, I have learned to hold the hand of God." Perhaps that is the paradox of the shutdown. That loss became the place where heaven entered most deeply. And so, the world continues to live with the question, what was it all for? Some say it was only nature, random and cruel. Others say it was a divine test, a pause button pressed by heaven. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the truth is less about why and more about what we became because of it. For if the earth stood still and we learned nothing, then it was only tragedy. But if we carry the lessons of love, faith, humility, and mercy, then perhaps it was also a hidden gift. One imam in Istanbul summarized it beautifully during a Friday sermon after restrictions lifted. When God wills, he can close the world with something unseen. And when God wills, he can open hearts with the same unseen. The question is not why it came, but what you will do now that it has gone. The congregation fell silent. Because deep down, everyone knew. The stillness had not disappeared. It lived on inside them, waiting to be remembered. In New York, Maria, the single mother saved by mysterious grocery bags, sat with her children years later. They asked, "Mama, was it scary?" She nodded. Yes, it was. But it was also the time I knew God was watching us the closest. Because every week, food came to our door when I thought we'd starve. Her children listened wide-eyed, realizing that survival was not luck, it was mercy. And in Madrid, Miguel, the taxi driver who ferried nurses for free, still drives his cab. When asked if he regrets risking his life, he shakes his head. No, because when I stand before God, I will not say, I saved myself. I will say, I carried his servants. These are not the stories of heroes or saints. They are the stories of humanity, ordinary, fragile, broken, yet capable of extraordinary grace when pressed by silence. And perhaps that is what heaven wanted us to see, that we are not as mighty as we think, nor as helpless as we fear. We are vessels of mercy, if only we choose to be. But as the noise of the world grows louder again, the risk remains. Will we drown out the echoes of silence? Will we forget the lessons written in grief, in kindness, in prayer? Because if memory fades, then the next silence may not be mercy. It may be warning. The year the earth stood still is gone, yet its memory lingers, like a faint melody after the music ends. And now, looking back, patterns emerge, threads of divine design woven through chaos. Think of the silence itself. Was it not a reminder that the world can stop in an instant, no matter how powerful nations appear? Towers, markets, planes, all bowed to something unseen. Pride collapsed, and fragility stood naked before us. Perhaps the silence was heaven's way of saying, you are not in control. Remember who is. Think of the kindness that bloomed. Bags of groceries left at doors, songs from balconies, strangers feeding strangers. These were not accidents. They were sparks of mercy. It was as if God scattered light in the darkest nights, showing us that humanity's heart can still burn bright if we allow it. And think of the faith rediscovered. Children leading parents in prayer, scientists confessing their limits, elders whispering final blessings through glass. In every corner, people who once forgot God suddenly cried out to him again. Was this not the truest miracle? That in global stillness, the Creator's voice was heard more clearly than in all the noise before? Yet, the silence also revealed shadows. Greed rose in hoarded masks. Selfishness thrived in inflated prices. Denial turned neighbors into enemies. These too were lessons, not of what we should be, but of what we must resist. For every Miguel who drove nurses for free, there was another who exploited fear. For every Maria saved by anonymous mercy, there was another family abandoned. The shutdown revealed the battle, not just between virus and body, but between selfishness and compassion, arrogance and humility, despair and faith. Perhaps this was the hidden war all along, a war for the human soul. Some say the pandemic was punishment. Others call it a natural disaster. But perhaps it was something else, a mirror. God does not always punish with fire. Sometimes he teaches with silence. And when the earth grew still, we were forced to face ourselves. What did we see? A humanity both fragile and resilient. A humanity both selfish and selfless. A humanity that can break and heal. In Nairobi, a teacher told her students, do not remember the virus. Remember the kindness it brought. In Rome, a priest urged, do not remember the fear. Remember the prayers it woke. And in Mexico, a grandmother said, do not remember the silence as empty. Remember it as sacred. Perhaps that is the challenge, to choose which memories we carry. Because memory shapes destiny. If we remember fear, we will live in fear. If we remember mercy, we will live in mercy. But memory fades. Already traffic drowns birdsong again. Already malls echo with noise. Already politicians boast as if nothing ever stopped them. Humanity is eager to forget. Yet forgetting carries danger. For silence, once wasted, may return. And next time, will we be ready? Or will heaven need to remind us again? The lesson is simple, yet eternal. Life is fragile. Love is sacred. Faith is vital. These truths, once forgotten, were written again in the stillness of 2020. So the real question is not, what happened when the earth stood still? The real question is, what will we do now that it moves again? One night in Spain, Clara, the widow whose husband never came home, stood at her window listening to laughter in the streets. For a moment, bitterness rose. But then she closed her eyes, folded her hands, and whispered, "Lord, if the world forgets, let me not forget. Let me carry the silence as prayer." And perhaps that is how history truly survives, not in headlines, but in hearts that choose to remember. Because when the earth stood still, it did not only stop time, it revealed eternity. The year the earth stood still was not just a chapter in history, it was a parable, a living sermon written across every continent, spoken in every language, and heard in every heart. And like all parables, its truth is not only in what happened, but in what it taught. It taught us that life is fragile. A single breath can separate life from death, and no wealth, no technology, no power can guarantee that breath. All is grace. Every inhale is borrowed from God. Do we live like we know this truth? It taught us that love is sacred. When the doors of the world locked, it was not money or titles that saved us, but kindness. A bag of groceries, a prayer whispered at midnight, a hand waving from a window. In the stillness, love spoke louder than fear. Do we treasure it now, or only when it is nearly lost? It taught us that faith is vital. When nations faltered, when science admitted its limits, when governments argued, people turned upward. Some for the first time, some with tears of return, some with childlike simplicity. And in those prayers, the silence itself became holy. Do we still pray with that urgency, or have we drifted back into forgetfulness? The pandemic was a storm, yes, it broke hearts, homes, and histories, but storms also reveal foundations. Some houses crumbled, others stood firm, and still others, though shaken, rebuilt stronger. Perhaps that was the divine pattern, not to destroy, but to test, not to punish, but to refine. The earth stood still, and in that stillness, heaven spoke. The question is not whether we heard it then, but whether we remember it now. So tonight, as we sit by this fireside, let us ask ourselves, what would you have done if you were the bus driver who kept driving, knowing each trip could be his last? What would you have done if you were the widow left behind while the world celebrated freedom? What would you have done if you were the child writing rainbows to her grandmother, not knowing if she'd ever hug her again? And what will you do now with the life you still hold, the breath you still draw, the love still around you? Do we recognize a blessing when it arrives late? Do we see God's mercy in ordinary hands? Do we need silence again to remind us? Because the truth is this: the earth may never stand still in the same way again, but each of us can choose to carry that silence within, to remember its lessons, to live differently because of it. Let us not wait for another crisis to teach us what we already know. Let us live now with gratitude, humility, compassion, and faith. For these are the treasures the shutdown revealed, treasures no virus can steal. And so, as the fire burns low tonight, remember this: when the earth stood still, it was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chance, a chance to love deeper, live wiser, and walk closer with God. Whether we seize that chance is up to us. Thank you, dear listener, for sitting with us by the fire tonight. You are part of this circle of remembrance, part of this family that chooses to hold the silence as sacred. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.